Welcome everyone to the Yale School of Art Speak to Me series. It's a series that started just about 2 weeks ago as a conversation with Claudia Rankin and Leah Miracore in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, and also in the throes of a national and international protest movement. And that conversation has evolved, and we continue with issues and important developments that are happening now. Our two speakers this evening, Muneer Ahmad and Lorella Praeli, we had to actually postpone the discussion last week because the decision with regard to DACA that they were so involved in took place that morning. So that's how present the issue was in our need to postpone so that they could speak further to the issues nationally and internationally. And so I am very grateful that both have joined us just a few days later to discuss not only that ruling, but further to the issues of immigration law and racial justice. Muneer Ahmad is a professor of law, a colleague here at Yale University, and he co-teaches the Worker and Immigrant Rights Advocacy Clinic there, where they've done important work with their students. And Lorella Praeli is the co-president of the national organization Community Change. She had been ACLU's deputy national political director, where she has fought to defend and expand the rights of immigrants and refugees. She and Muneer have been important and passionate advocates and proponents of immigration rights and refugee rights, and have played an important role in protecting those rights since DACA was adopted under the Obama administration. DACA, I'm just going to say again, is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, and it's a program that provides nearly 750 undocumented immigrants the rights to attend college, to lawfully work, to hold a driver's license, and to open a bank account regardless of their lack of citizenship. And since the Obama administration, the current administration has been very intent on revoking those safeties provided. And as a result, there have been sanctuary universities established and sanctuary cities, of which New Haven is one. And so we are the more recent and congratulatory information is that the Supreme Court upheld a 5-4 decision that ruled that the current administration broke a federal law in trying to end the DACA program, but it certainly doesn't ensure its future. And Muneer and Lorella, I was wondering whether you could speak to that, because as we are at a School of Art, we are less versed in the law. You had brought up a very good point. I mean, we think 5-4. We know that one of the judges, conservative judges, voted for this decision, but more importantly, the one Justice Sotomayor, the Latinx justice, had actually added a very important clause to the decision, which I would have not located, and you were very specific in the place within the ruling where she had actually mentioned that this was not only a procedural ruling, a matter of law, but it was a matter that brought in the importance of social context and the enduring role that animus and racial discrimination played within this that had not been picked up by the other justices. I was wondering if you could speak about that, because that's a really important point to bring up.
Okay, so we're gonna jump right in. Thank you, Marta, and thank you, Muneer, for the opportunity to be in conversation and in community today as we make meaning of the moment that we are in and situate the fights that we've made commitments to within a broader context. So I want to first start by explicitly naming that we are having this conversation with no Black people on the panel, and that limits some of our conversation. So Muneer and I are both aware of what we have to offer today and its limits, and want to make sure that we ground in that. And before we get into the analysis of the ruling, which Muneer will do, I wanted to start by really situating the moment that we're in within a broader context, and perhaps first start by sharing with people that beyond my bio and the titles and the specific roles I have played in different organizations, first and above all, I'm a human being, and I am formerly undocumented. And I say that at the top because it has shaped my experience and my existence as part of this country. And it has been a motivating factor, and it has really animated my fight and my commitment to immigrant justice and racial justice in this country. I was undocumented for 14 years, and I'm originally from Peru, and had the privilege to be a part of a much smaller, back in the day, group of young undocumented people who had big dreams, a lot of hope, and a lot of heart, and not a lot of resources or attention back in the day. And so as I transition into the talk today, I wanted to say that in order for us to be able to talk about the decision, we have to first situate it within the movement and within the broader politics and movement for Black liberation and racial justice that we're experiencing right now. And so the decision is one data point and part of a long struggle for justice in a fight that really started from a place of self-interest. That for young undocumented people, the fight in the beginning was really about education equity and access and the ability to work. It was really where higher education became an entry point for us and an organizing space, which then turned into a broader agenda and calls for legalization, which then evolved into a deep interrogation of our immigration enforcement system, the current scheme of immigration, and beyond. And historically, when I think about our immigration system, it is a system, I want us to think about about the immigration system as a system and set of structures, and the role of political actors in the making of the system that we have today, which is a system that is not grounded in people first, but a system that criminalizes immigrants, and one that treats brown and Black people as disposable. So it is here where we get to the politics of disposability, which I think we'll talk about later. And the other point I'd like to make at the top is that this is that this movement, the immigrant youth movement and the movement intervention are entering into the space is really about the evolution of a movement that at its core, it is about belonging, and that centers questions of citizenship and personhood and power, the power to make the impossible possible, and the magic that happens when people who are grounded in their self-determination and in the belief that collective action can shape the present and the future. And lastly, we have to situate this decision within a broader context of the powerful and beautiful uprisings and movement being led by the movement for Black lives in really fighting and centering anti-Black racism, centering Black liberation, and leading or pushing us to really reckon with our history and our present. And so before we got into the specifics of the decision from last week, which is a big victory, but it's just one step, I wanted us to step back a little bit and understand where it falls on this long arc to justice, to give you a quick sense of, or a taste of really our movement's history, and to invite you to co-create with us as we engage in this conversation, because there's much to be figured out as we continue to chart the path forward.
So I also just want to say thank you to Marta for inviting us to be part of this conversation, and to just express appreciation for this series of conversations that you are leading. It really is, I think, such an important moment for leadership in institutions all around the country. And I think you're setting a really important example in the kinds of conversations you are inviting and the difficult conversations that you are insisting upon for the community in and around the School of Art. Let me just pick up where Lorella left off, which is that we have taken a little bit of a sideways point of entry to the question that you asked about the decision, because as Lorella was saying, the decision as we see it and understand it has to be understood in terms of its social meaning, and not merely or even primarily in terms of its legal meaning. And in order to access that social meaning, having something of a historical frame for the DREAM movement and the immigrants' rights movement is important, and situating it in relation to the current moment, which is something that frankly we're still, I think, in the early stages of understanding, we think is also fundamental. So with that context that Lorella laid out about a movement that began, in arguably a very narrow place of a population, a subset of the undocumented population, embracing an identity of exceptionalism that was a basis for a kind of moral and political claim to a pathway to citizenship for themselves, to this broadening out to, in fact, being leaders not only for undocumented youth, but being leaders for the undocumented, for the population of undocumented people, to broadening out even further to thinking about, as Lorella described, the systems of the systemic operation of immigration and the ways in which it intersects with criminalization and racialization. That is an evolution that has taken place over the course of roughly a decade. And so the DACA decision that came out last Thursday is really a pinpoint in this course. It is salient. It is, as Lorella described, an incredibly important victory. But the victory really resides in terms of its impact outside of the courtroom, and in our view, all of the work that was done outside of law to help to create a moment in which a temporary moment of legal intervention. So with that said, let me just say a couple of words going directly to your question, Marta, about this opinion that Justice Sotomayor wrote separately from the rest of the justices. And as I think people understand, the DACA program, which was created under the Obama administration, the Trump administration in September 2017 moved to terminate the program. And that triggered a set of lawsuits that were filed across the country. The clinic that I co-direct at Yale Law School brought the first case challenging the termination. And eventually all of these cases worked their way through the courts. And 9 of them were consolidated for the purposes of argument before the Supreme Court. That argument happened in November of last year, and the decision last week finally, although in many ways importantly, temporarily resolved the question of whether DACA was properly terminated or not. And on one, the predominant decision, the predominant reasoning of the decision is procedural. The argument that Chief Justice Roberts signed on to, and he was the one who authored the main decision, essentially says not that that DACA can't be terminated, but that the method that was followed was improper, that the government had failed to provide proper reasons for the termination, and that failure to essentially follow what's called the Administrative Procedure Act, a statute that is intended to ensure the regular operation of the bureaucratic state. They had not followed those procedures, and therefore the decision to terminate DACA would be set aside. Now there's a last section of the opinion that Justice Roberts authored, which essentially gives the back of the hand to another set of claims that were brought in some, but not all of the cases. And those claims were equal protection claims. The claims were not merely was this a violation of the procedural requirements for the regular operation of government. This was also a racially animated policy to terminate DACA, specifically against Latinx and especially Mexican immigrants, and therefore was a violation of the guarantee of equal protection under the law provided by the Constitution. Justice Roberts says in the end of his opinion, effectively he says this has nothing to do with race. The allegations in the case don't come anywhere close to the requirement, not to prove that this is about race, but even to have the right to move forward in court to try to prove that this is about race. And very disappointingly, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Kagan and Justice Breyer, three reliably center-left justices, sign on to that opinion. And Justice Sotomayor, the one and only Latinx justice on the court, besides Justice Thomas, the only other person of color on the court, she is the only one among 9 who rejects that view. And what she does in a very short opinion, 2.5 pages roughly, is to say on its face what she says is, no, the DACA recipients have alleged enough facts about the racist statements of this president, of this administration, the anti-immigrant animus that we have seen both when he was a candidate and when he's been president, to at least make it plausible that the DACA termination was part and parcel of a larger anti-immigrant and in particular anti-Latinx and anti-Mexican animus. So that's what she says on the surface. But what I think is so significant about that, returning to the point about the social meaning of this case, is that her understanding of the DACA termination as at least in being possibly motivated by racial animus, hers is the only one that's consistent with the experience of DACA recipients. DACA recipients, the 700,000 plus DACA recipients, when their DACA was terminated, their thought wasn't, oh, the government didn't follow the proper procedure in ending my DACA. The lived experience, by and large, was this is yet one more expression of a racist, anti-immigrant set of policies and procedures that we've seen from this administration. And so in that sense, 2 points here, and then I'll wrap up. One, Justice Sotomayor is the only one of the 9 justices who embraces a jurisprudential or advances a jurisprudential vision that is consistent with the lived experience of the DACA recipients themselves. And second, in the immigrants' rights movement, this case, I think, is and should be properly understood as an important step, not the achievement of, but an important step toward racial justice. And so here we see this gaping chasm between the aspirations and I think the achievements of the immigrants' rights movement in obtaining an important step toward racial justice and the opinion of the court, which explicitly disclaims that this has anything to do with race at all. So there's a tension, a contradiction, a paradox there that I think is important to note and to understand.
So my question then would be, we hear these decisions and we sort of rest and we realize that the tension is still there and the resistance needs to continue. And so my question is then, what is the next step in coalition building, that if this is one decision of one justice in terms of racial injustice, and that we see across the board so prevalently racial injustice being the matter of what is going on. I mean, Lorella, you spoke about individual disposability and expendability, and you said that you were really influenced by Miriam Makeba and about the issues around abolition. And what we're seeing right now is a questioning or protesting about a security structure that is intended to be built up to protect the United States, and that security measures are based on a weaponized state, and then actually takes advantage of those that have been deemed individually disposable and expendable. And it's a way to bring in the discussion about what you had spoken about 2 years ago in Critical Practice about the building of the building change is also about the building of narratives, and it's knowledge production, and it is also how do you then change the law.
I think yes to all of those things, but I may not center the law as much in that. I think part of the beauty of movement building work is that movements don't wait for the law, right? Their role is to imagine. They do not ask the law for permission. They imagine, they confront, they build. And that really, in its essence, it captures the experience of undocumented young people. And Muneer and I have had many conversations about the genius or the beauty and the power of the undocumented immigrant youth movement and its ability to enact the role of citizenship before the law has determined or given us that citizenship. And so we should spend some time on that. I think the other is we've got to go back and continue to do what we know how to do best. And that is to create both a broad coalition that really centers in the lived experience of people, and that follows the leadership of those who are directly impacted. And so it is not the same for people who have never been undocumented, or are not, even for people who have been undocumented, like I am no longer undocumented. And I would say my engagement with this fight is a little different from that of my sister's, who is currently undocumented. And so in a lot of ways, Maria should have much more space and take up much more space. And we should really think about Maria's current experience, because I now am operating from a place of privilege. I have knowledge and history, but I am much differently situated than my sister, who is currently a DACA recipient. And so we've got to go back to really continue to build people power, in my opinion. We should be bigger than we are. We should be enabling individual and collective transformations, because those are there is let me just be clear about one thing, which is no organization, no strategy could have delivered on what is happening in our country right now. So we also have to have enough humility to recognize the role of movements. So no organization or campaign plan or master strategy could have delivered the moment that we're living in. And it is also true that movement and organization is critical, because the movement has to be able to come in and have some infrastructure to take the uprising, to take the openings, and to move with people in a particular direction. And so what I would contend in this moment is that, given that the DACA recipient does not actually, it's not the end point. It is just one more data point, as Muneer pointed out. It is one more win, but understanding that the administration is back and trying to figure out how we take DACA away via a different way, for the purpose, by the way, not only of disrupting people's lives, but with a goal in mind to use undocumented young people who have DACA right now as a bargaining chip to try to extract from Democrats and the movement other concessions. And that those concessions, namely, are about who else gets to come into this country. They are about the politics at the border. They're about asylum, and they are about the future of our immigration system. And so we've got to have a legal strategy. We've got to have a narrative strategy. We've got to have a people and power building strategy. And we've got to be able to operate in every one of those lanes, right? The right people have to be operating in every one of those lanes. And our job in movement building work should be to create enough space for more people who are impacted to come forward, right? And to be a part of developing the strategy that is going to allow us to build towards that vision. And that is the role of campaigns, right? Campaigns play a role in movements, but they're not the end all be all either. They're just a moment and a time and place.
You know, Lorella, your point about campaigns and both the way in which they are so essential for the moment, but they are ephemeral, right? They're for the moment and only of the moment. I think is really important to kind of understand where we are right now, and again to kind of just think of the DACA decision as a bit of an anchor, but one in waters that are very fast moving, so the anchor doesn't maybe go all the way down. They're part of what the campaign around DACA as a subset of a larger campaign around Dreamers, as part of a subset of a larger campaign around immigrant justice. Part of what it did successfully was to create the conditions for one justice of the Supreme Court to deviate from the standard expectation of what he should do, right? And so that was incredibly important, but it also was ephemeral. And Chief Justice Roberts is done with DACA right now. He is done deciding DACA. He's done thinking about DACA. He's done acting on DACA. For this term, he's essentially done acting on immigrants' rights. That's it. And so there was an enormous amount of effort, the campaign level effort that went into creating the social conditions and expectations, in fact, that Justice Roberts, who could have, if he wanted to, have found a jurisprudential way to go in the other direction, to come along this way. And so it speaks again to, I think, kind of the importance of these building blocks of movements, but also what are essentially, temporary moves and shifts in these ever-changing waters. The other thing I just want to kind of lift up is this notion that the DREAM movement, it's not unique to DREAM and to undocumented youth, but undocumented youth have so exquisitely illustrated this idea of anticipating the law and willing the law into existence. So the audacity of saying we are Americans, undocumented Americans, this contradiction in terms, this what has been referred to as a performative contradiction. The sense of how could you be both undocumented and American at the same time? And that sense of performative contradiction creates the space in which to move into new spaces, into new identities that don't yet exist. And that's, again, not something that only Dreamers have done, but something that Dreamers have done with remarkable success, and actually with a kind of aesthetic to it that is inviting and attractive and energetic and has brought people along with them and to a space that did not exist 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So the anticipating and creating of new spaces, the law is oftentimes a laggard. If in the courts are laggards as actors in society. And this is a case, I think, of the court catching up to where society has been. Society got there because of the movement, and the movement got society there through a series of campaigns.
Muneer, I'm just pulling here. I went back and read Langston Hughes' poem yesterday, or one of, and the reason why I'm lifting it is because it is true, but there's also been an evolution in our identity. and what it means to be young and undocumented in this country, and what it means to belong here, and what kind of responsibility, right? When you talk about the enactment or embracing citizenship, for people who do not have the right to vote, for people who are not U.S. citizens, I think about it is such a beautiful expression of what it means to be a citizen of this country, even while we're not citizens, because we are our engagement with the American political process and culture and society goes beyond like it challenges that which many of our parents accept as a given. For example, the fight of dreamers is as much about racial justice as it is about immigrant justice today. In fact, it is engaging and challenging the broader immigrants' rights movement and calling on the movement to actually pick a side, to ground in an ideology and to ground in an understanding and a critique of the world that we've inhabited, and to see its role as one that is beyond like the responsibility that we have isn't just to deliver on citizenship or a pathway to citizenship for the people who are presently in the United States, but to actually understand why we haven't been able to win, and to understand the role of race throughout the course of the movement and its engagement in trying to secure citizenship for people. And the beauty of the dreamers is that even though they are not citizens, they call on America to be better, which is where I was going in the beginning with my comment, right? Oh, let America be America again, the land that has never been yet, and yet must be, the land where every person is free. And I share that because that is the moment that we are living in right now. And to recognize that the fight that immigrant youth have engaged in, by virtue of first a necessity, but then actually embracing what it really means to be a part of this country and the responsibility that we believe comes with being a part of this country, which is to make America be a country, right, where every person is free. And so there's no more powerful expression in my view of what it means to really embrace the role of citizenship in this country. Yeah, so I'm, you know, did not have that. It's not eloquent, it's not all tight, but feels to me like it speaks to the kind of transformation that happens when you're in this country, and the kind of transformation that happens when you are engaging in a fight for racial justice, and you begin to recognize that your fight is interconnected to other fights, and that my freedom is bound to your freedom, and that this project that is America calls on all of us, right, to interrogate the systems, to interrogate that which is described as inevitable and as the only way of being.
Yeah, I think that, you know, your point, and you elaborated on this earlier too, about breaking out of the perceived inevitability of our politics. That's in some ways, to me, the most powerful lesson of this current moment, triggered by the murder of George Floyd, and the idea that actually, you know, notions as radical as defund the police, which has been a part of activist conversations for 20 years, could actually be the fulcrum of national conversation and be made so in the course of, 48 hours or 96 hours, speaks to actually the hold that these dominant paradigms have on us, that we think that there's no way to break out of them. And, I appreciate the kind of return to this, even the rhetorical move to talk about things like freedom, citizenship with a small c, because it is a reminder of and transformation, I think, is the other word I want to kind of lift up from what you said, Lorella, because it's a reminder that there is a liberatory quality to the movement now, which is not about securing a narrow piece of legislation. It is about securing space in the world for people to live as people, and for it's a claim of humanity, which is not going to be secured in the first instance by legislation. I mean, that's certainly what our history has shown us time and time again. And so that rhetorical move, I think that I found myself meditating in the last couple of weeks actually about what it means to have a liberation movement. And it begs the question of, what are we seeking liberation from? Who is seeking liberation, and from what? And those are big questions that contain questions, multitudes of questions within them, but also hold a kind of power for transformation, which I think is part of what makes this moment, as dangerous a moment as it feels, also such a kinetic moment for society. Marta, we're not letting you get a word in edgewise.
No, I'm very happy to listen, but I was wondering if you can bring a bit more into the point of immigration rights as a racial justice matter, and how it aligns to and can align with Black Lives Matter in this moment, and perhaps not be seen as a completely separate situation, and the coalition building in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
Muneer, do you want to start, or do you want me to start?
I mean, I'll say a couple of things, and maybe we can have a little bit back and forth on this as well. One thing, I guess, one place I would start with is to talk historically about the immigrants' rights movement. And this is a short history. This is not the immigration history of the United States, but even just looking at the modern immigration history, which I would, date to, if we're talking about kind of legalization movements, only date back to essentially the early 1970s. And if we think about kind of the kind of modern period of immigration, 1965 is kind of the starting point when the immigration law was modified in a way that opened up immigration, kind of lifted all of most all of the past racial and geographic restrictions that previously had been central to our immigration system. So, we're talking about a history of just, roughly 50 years. And in those 50 years, for the vast majority of that period, when there has been activism and political engagement around immigration reform, for the vast majority of that history, it has not been driven by immigrants, and has not been driven by people of color. Instead, immigration reform has been understood as a balance of interests. And when immigration, the last major legalization program, which was enacted in 1986, there was talk of a three-legged stool. And the three legs of the stool were legalization, enforcement, and regulation of employment. And what's reflected in that is that there is a piece that has space for a kind of civil rights understanding of immigration, a fairness or an equity component. But the immigration space was dominated actually by concerns around business interests and security, the security apparatus that comes with enforcement. So 2/3 of the vision of immigration reform in the United States has been dominated by non-civil rights concerns, and oftentimes civil concerns that are hostile to civil rights. And it's really, I would say, only in the past 20 years that we have seen the emergence, and this goes to Lorella's earlier point, we've seen the emergence of the most affected individuals being in the leadership of the movement for immigrants' rights, and actually a change from seeking changes in immigration policy to seeking immigrant justice. The fact that has coincided with that those leaders have been people of color, and it's coincided with or been constitutive of a movement toward developing a set of political commitments to cross-racial and multi-ethnic solidarity is part of what I think has given rise then to a politics of racial justice in the immigrants' rights movement. But it's very recent. And, you know, it's thankfully now the movement is big enough that I don't know everyone in it. But 10 years ago, it wasn't. 10 years ago, you know, pretty much everybody who was a leader in the movement was known to everybody else because the movement was so small. And the growth has been exponential. It has been very young, which is a huge source of its power. And also, just on that generational point, I think that the opportunities for cross-racial, multiracial, multi-ethnic allyship and solidarity and coalition are so much more robust in these younger generations than they were in the older ones. And that's all part of what I think is kind of giving rise to the possibilities for meaningful allyship and coalition around race, including with regard to anti-Black racism.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe I would add a couple of things, Muneer. One is that we have to ask the question of why have we failed, or why have we not won, and then relatedly, what does it mean to win? And so when you look at the last several decades, even as you take in the DACA win, which was huge, and there were a lot of barriers to getting to victory on that, I think the biggest mistake, or one of the biggest mistakes we've made in the immigrants' rights field, has been to think of this as a matter of policy, not as a matter of race. And fundamentally, at its core, it is a fight about who gets to be an American. And it is about whiteness. It is about race. It is about power and contesting power. And so we can engage in every strategy that we want to try to get Republicans to sign on to a bill or a letter in support of Dreamers or the broader undocumented community. But if we do not have a critique of the moment and an understanding that you can have the best immigration reform proposal, you can try to balance different interests, but at the core of this fight, there's a question about power and belonging. And that at the core of that, or at the center of that, it's a question about race and who gets to come into this country and who gets to call it home. And it is very hard to engage in that conversation. And it is not a conversation that the movement has wanted to embrace because it is so contentious. Because you're trying, to the point of coalition building, in the history of the immigrants' rights movement, there's been a question about US-based labor, right? And US citizens, and a question about the labor of immigrants. And that's just one component of the many parts of the conversation in immigration. And so I would say I would add that piece to this. The other piece that I would add is when we think about the connection between our movement and the movement for Black lives, and what is getting upended in this moment and exposed for what it is, I would talk about the role of the carceral state as one that both seeks to criminalize and punish people of color, first Black people, and then people of color. And so we can't talk about policing without talking about enforcement, and we can't talk about immigration enforcement without talking about policing. And so that's the moment that we're in right now, and trying to upend these systems and to understand then what do we do with our awareness about why do they exist and who do they benefit, to the point of some of the questions that you were putting on the table. And what do we do then with that knowledge? Do we pretend it does not exist and carry forward and have the fight and conversation within the paradigms of the past? Or is this a moment where we push forward and try to co-create a new paradigm and a new framework to engage in the present fight?
I have many more questions, but I think that we should open up to the public for questions. So, and then I'll try to weave in some additional ones because it's such an important subject. Lindsay, maybe if you have a question, if you could use the hand raise indicator, is it? No.
No questions yet.
I had actually a comment about combating narratives. And it's, you know, the narrative of, as you were saying, Lorella, about undocumented citizenship and the future of the country, and that built on the right and the hope, and then this combating narrative, usually by forces that want to control immigration, in place racist policies, is one of breaking down the structure of the family. And, you know, first we see the Dreamers Project being based on an entangled relationship of children to parents. And then the counter narrative and an attempt is to break that entanglement of children and parents. And that's one situation that brings me back to the text by Hortense Spillers about mamas, baby, papas, maybe, about also the policy in the US and in New York City about who, you know, broken Black families in the ghetto and who had rights to unemployment and not. And then it takes me further back to something as canonical for the art history and for artists, which is Walker Evans and James Agee's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which documents white Southern tenant workers. And then Richard Wright comes around to comment on that through 12 Million Voices to say, wait, that's not just a white tenant farmer situation. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to that embattled terrain of the building of the narrative of the family and the claim to that.
Lorella, do you want to start?
No, you can start.
Well, I mean, I think maybe just to start on the dreamer point. So part of the narrative that was, one thing maybe just make explicit is that the identity of the dreamer was in its original form constructed by non-dreamers. It was a legislation drafted by progressives on Capitol Hill who had a notion that in the complicated political terrain of the country in the early 2000s around immigration, that if we couldn't cut a deal for comprehensive immigration reform, which is kind of the holy grail of immigration reform, that there may be a way to achieve justice for a smaller group of people. And in a sense, thus the dreamer was born. And so the DREAM Act was created the space for an identity before, in many ways, the identity of a dreamer was embraced and inhabited by the dreamers themselves. And I raised that because in the early stages of that identity formation, innocence, a narrative of innocence, was integral to that narrative. And Marty, your question kind of goes to this: that the narrative that was advanced, and again, largely advanced not by dreamers themselves, but by others speaking on their behalf. So this goes to the pitfalls, the dangers of having movements that are led by people other than those most affected. That innocence narrative was that these were people who, through no fault of their own, if you Google dreamer and through no fault of their own, it will come up a million times. People who, through no fault of their own, came to this country at a very young age, and in all respects, other than on paper, are American. That's some version of that has been the kind of narrative that was advanced early on. And to talk about the innocence of, the innocence piece is tied integrally to children. So the innocence of children, which has such deep kind of narrative resonance, is part of the reason that it was so powerful. But to talk about the innocence of children is by necessity to cast this version of guilt on the parents. And that was a way then of severing the relationship between parent and child. And to Lorella's point about disposability, the parents become disposable, right? The parents were criminals. So there's a criminalization that happens through this narrative. The parents were the criminals who smuggled their children into the country. The children should not be blamed for the wrongdoing of their parents. So now there's a kind of biblical overlay to this as well about not visiting the sins of the father upon the son. And this then becomes a way to carve out a acceptable, palatable, actually savior-driven model of immigration reform, which doesn't force us to engage with the larger structural issues around economic exploitation of immigrants, criminalization of immigrants, racialization of immigrants in the same way. And it does all of that through a language of family that also has the effect of suggesting that the children, this is the savior point, the children need to be saved, the children need to be rescued. From whom? From their parents. And so there's actually this deep, I mean, it's painful because these are essentially our friends on Capitol Hill who kind of set this in motion. But very deep in the structure of the original DREAM framework is the idea that the state essentially needs to rescue children from parents who have been abusive or neglectful. So there's this parallel between the welfare state of rescuing children from abuse and neglect and a narrow form of immigration reform, which saves children from the poor judgment and criminal acts of their parents. So that is, now I'll end there. Maybe Lorella, ask you to kind of pick up on what happened to that, because that was a narrative that was kind of offered to undocumented youth. And when undocumented youth stepped into the space to actually kind of move that movement forward, they very quickly rejected that aspect of the narrative.
Yeah, I might say that it took some time and it wasn't equal across the movement, but there was a lot of interrogation of that and wondering how we got there. And then, you know, when I think about the ways in which we told our stories, it still shocks me today that there was no mention of the role of my mother in my life at the very beginning of my coming out. But it was all about proving and making the case for why we belonged and why we needed some recognition. And so we were really approaching it from a place of asking for permission. And I say that because it's such a different place from where we are now. Over time, we moved into a place of, you know, we used to say undocumented, unafraid, and unapologetic. And I don't think that we were unapologetic in the beginning. Perhaps we were unapologetic in sort of the narrow sense of the word, unapologetic in sort of transgressing and naming and entering the public sphere by coming out as undocumented. But but we were also afraid, and we were not unapologetic. Otherwise, we would not have picked up the mic and said, my name is Lorella, I graduated at the top of my class, and here are the 5 reasons why you should place a bet on me. Here are the 5 reasons why I think I am worthy of some recognition and the embrace of the state. And so it took time to undo that. And even now, I would say it's so pervasive that even in the stories that are told now, and in the way, even in the arguments that were made to the court, Muneer, about particularly after coronavirus broke, and the essential nature of DACA recipients who also happen to be essential workers or nurses or doctors, that we're still deploying those narratives. And so that speaks to the sort of pervasive nature of certain narratives. And I think we have a lot of work to do to undo them. I want to bring us even further, because I appreciate the conversation that we've had about family. And it's when we talk about it that way, and I know we have in the past, it's actually quite painful. As someone who whose mother was also undocumented, and as someone who recognizes that I would not be who I am, and nor would I be sitting here with all of you today had it not been for the role that she's played in my life and the sacrifices she's made. And I also say that realizing how problematic it is that we often talk about the dreams our parents gave up for us to have this life, as if it is their role to essentially be in service of us. And why do we live in a world where people have to give that kind of sacrifice? And what is the role of both race and class within that? But just to move us further along on narrative, at first, when we were engaging in the conversation around coronavirus and engaging in advocacy on the Hill, we talked a lot about the essential nature of many immigrant workers. And that was sort of like, here's the case. And we might be there again when we're talking about recovery next year, especially if we have a Democrat in the White House. But it strikes me that there's a contradiction in the essential nature of the immigrant and their contributions, is in that they also become the workers who are disposable. And that the essential nature of all of these workers also speaks about their disposability in our mind and in our politics. In that and to add to that we do not see it our responsibility to even protect them or to give them access to healthcare or access to free and accessible testing, all while we drive this narrative about their contributions in this moment. And I don't know, I'm saying all these things and I'm not sure what to make of it, because I realize in this conversation how much of that narrative and that framework has driven the conversation to date. And I worry, and so it can have some it has takeoff with members on the Hill. It has takeoff with the press, in the same ways that, or in similar ways that the Dreamer narrative did. And I name it today, worried about, or wanting to spend more time on it, to think about what are we naming now that may take root now, but be with us for a very long time. And so what are the advantages of advancing and the benefits of advancing that narrative, and what are its limits? So there were certainly significant benefits to the Dreamer narrative, and they were also very damaging. Right? In that time and place, we felt we needed to make the case, and we thought because it was given to us, this is the way to make the case about why you belong and why you should get a shot at legalization. And here we are today, not being real about the fact that not every dreamer goes on to post-secondary education. And there are dreamers in the field doing agricultural work, and there are dreamers with a lab coat doing research and or being doctors. And so we exist in all shades and forms of occupation. And so when do we get to a place in conversation about belonging that where your value and worth does not come from what you're able to produce or contribute in our country, but simply by virtue of the fact that you are human and that you're here?
So, Laura, I think that this goes to the ways in which so long the claims to membership for outsiders of various kinds have the argument has been that the only way to get on the inside is by proving your neoliberal contributions. And so through labor, through self-governance, through a kind of a moral innocence, all of those elements of what we understand to be the neoliberal citizen. And so in some ways, I think that one of the big and exciting questions that is presented in the current moment is, can we formulate a basis for equality in a post-neoliberal world based upon a post-neoliberal logic? Because we have, for these past decades, at a minimum, always actually returned to a new neoliberal logic for claims of belonging. And that has proved successful to varying degrees, but it always announces its own limit. It always announces its own limit.
That's a whole other issue that's really important to unpack, is the issue of neoliberalism in dominating and preventing change.